Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's presentation, 2026 IT Reality Check, how to navigate market shifts, infrastructure changes, and cyber threats. I'm Laura Shafer, and I'm the Vice President of Product Marketing here at 1111 Systems. And now I would like to turn the time over to today's speakers, who are Jason Buffington. He's the Principal Analyst at Data Protection Matters, and Kaushik Ray, who is the Chief Experience Officer here at 1111 Systems. Jason and Kaushik, there have been a lot of changes in the marketplace over the last few years, and this has led to a lot of uncertainty. So what's in store for this year?
So one of my favorite times of year is in January of 2026, when we all have fresh ideas and new initiatives and usually a lot of questions. And so one of the things I'm really looking forward to sharing today is we've curated some data from a variety of different analysts and respected sources of information. And I hope that we get a chance to unpack what's going on within the data center, which is still the crown jewels for most organizations today. Certainly, you cannot talk about IT in 2026 or 25 for that matter without talking about ransomware and cyber attacks. We're going to visit that a little bit around cyber resilience. And then look at more of the posture of organizational or business level resilience and not just everything around IT as well. Kaushik, one of the things I'm most excited about from this series of questions is I'm going to present some data from some of these curated sources. I'm going to add my lens from an analyst perspective, but I'm really looking forward to both your historical lens. You and I have, I think collectively we figured out almost 60 years of resilience experience just between the two of us. So that's gonna be fun to just kind of banter on. And then certainly as Chief Experience, you've seen what customers large and small are doing around these initiatives. And I'd love to hear that real world point of view. So let's get into our first topic and talk about the crown jewels of most data centers. And we saw a lot of hype and angst when it came to VMware as the center of most universes within organizations. There was a survey that was done by CIO Magazine, actually Veeam sponsored it a couple years ago. And one of the things I thought would be fun to revisit on this was that survey back then asked what customers were thinking about and feeling in 2024. And some of those questions said, hey, what's it going to be like in 2 years? Guess what? It is 2 years later. Right? So let's go ahead and talk about some of those predictions and then find out from real world as we start 2026, how does that really look? Now, the first one was a sentiment question. The first one was, based on the Broadcom licensing changes, and in fact, there have been a couple other licensing changes that manifested since the original 2024 acquisition, how likely is it that you would decrease your use of VMware? I think it's worth pointing out, though, when organizations were asked in this survey, how many of them were going to completely abandon VMware as their hypervisor of choice. The exact percentage of organizations that said they were going to abandon VMware was 0. Nobody said, I'm just never going to use VMware again. But there was a sentiment around better than half of organizations. So let's add the numbers up, 23, 33, so 56% said that they are likely to decrease their use of VMware, compared to 16% said, no, we're good. And I think that's interesting because if you get rid of the neutrals, that means it's about a 4-to-1 mix of those thinking of decreasing versus not. That's a sentiment question, right? And often those are fueled by emotions as much as practicality. But then we asked, or they asked at the time, what's going to happen on your next renewal cycle? So this was 2024. So this was the 2025 renewals. And about half of them said, we're going to cut that check one more time. And then we're going to start working on stuff. That said, about a third of folks said, maybe we don't need everything on vSphere. Maybe it could be on some lesser or different hypervisors. Some said maybe it could be in a cloud. Does it all have to be running on Metal themselves? So we've got some sentiment. We've got some, we're going to do this one more time. And then we've got this, we're going to start to work something which looks a lot more hybrid. Now, this is an ecosystem that you live in. And in fact, 1111 is actually a premier Broadcom partner. So I'm sure you've seen this from all directions. How did it actually turn out?
Yeah, it's very interesting that the numbers, in my opinion, reflects what we are seeing as well, right? Where when the initial Broadcom announcements came in, the sentiments and the feelings were running wild, right? Because it was a massive change for a lot of customers. A lot of customers we have talked to have seen, price increases up to 8 times. It depends upon how they were using, what they were using specifically of the VMware ecosystem. But we've kind of 2 years later see that what you're right inside of the stats describe is kind of what we're seeing. A lot of people have tried out different things. It was kind of a awakening moment for them to say, well, can we look at moving to some other hypervisor, some other technology? And yes, we have seen some adoption of containers more than in the prior years. Containers have been around for many, many years, and we saw some of our customers have moved some of the workloads into containers. That makes sense. Some tried other technologies. Hypervisor definitely, Microsoft Hyper-V definitely comes up. And some have probably accelerated some of their plans that they already had underway for moving into the hyperscalers, right?
Yes.
But for the most part, I would say we haven't seen a massive decline in the workloads that are running on VMware. I think
Totally agree with that.
That's just the reality that we're seeing.
So let's kind of dig into that a little bit more. So we had a few more questions that were part of that original survey back 2 years ago. And again, the original question said, well, in 2 years, so we parenthetically added, now that's now, right? So by 2026, what percent of your production servers will be? And this is actually a question that I've been an analyst in one form or another for better than 15 years. And this is a question I've been doing for as long as there's been IaaS out there, or even SaaS. And that is, what percentage of your production infrastructure will be running on physical servers within the data center, virtualized machines within the data center, or cloud-hosted infrastructure, which in my mind includes certainly a lot of IaaS, but certainly some PaaS and some SaaS as well. And I think it's interesting that even when customers were feeling that angst, and as you mentioned, some of them were starting to embrace or maybe accelerate their hybrid cloud or their infrastructure as a service plans, and yet they said 2 years from now, 20% of their servers were still going to run on physical metal in the building. And I'm just going to go on a limb and say that if you're running physical servers in 2026, you're doing it for the right reasons. You've already done the tear downs. You've already done the consolidations. You have a reason why you're running real metal, and you should probably keep doing that. About another 40% are running in VMs. And yeah, VMs on the data center are not going away anytime soon. And then yes, cloud hosted comes in. I think what's also interesting, though, is when CIO Magazine actually ran this survey, they had it from both status quo, 2024, as well as what the respondents thought the 2026 data was going to look like. And what you're seeing is there's not a whole lot of shift, right? So over a 2-year span, 6% of the physical went into some other modality. 4% of VMs did, right? So again, this was a Broadcom VMware-centric survey, and yet there was only a 4% declination between the percentage of VMs that were running back in 24 and the percent running now, and of course, cloud hosting being the net sum gain on that. Let's round out this slide, though, because if virtualization is still going to be the centerpiece of most organizations' data center, one of the other questions that CIO asked was, if you're going to run a new virtual machine in 2026, seems so far away at the time, where would you prefer to run it? And this was in the midst of all this Broadcom sentiment. And yet the top response was on vSphere, right? And I think that's really interesting. And oh, by the way, yes, Hyper-V hits the top 3, Nutanix hits the top 3. I think it's interesting, by the way, your color coding is the green technologies are data center hypervisors. The blue technologies are IaaS-based infrastructure. I think that still shows there's not a mix. And oh, by the way, probably my favorite part of this is while VMware might be the top choice, you do see a pretty healthy mix, right? I do think that you are seeing more on the idea of where could my testing servers go? Where could my dev servers go? Does it all have to be on vSphere or not along the way? When I shared this data with your leadership team, Kaushik, back a couple months ago, Brett, the CEO, had a great observation on this around as organizations think about the impetus around private cloud infrastructure, especially with high compute scenarios and AI scenarios, all the things where you want that data locality. arguably vSphere actually is the third center of gravity besides where you might run AWS or Azure as the private cloud of choice. I think this starts to manifest some of that hybridity. Can I use that as a word?
Sure.
What are you seeing?
Now, I think first I wanted to comment on the left-hand side as well. So, because what you see very interestingly here is the biggest move happened towards cloud-hosted instances, right? And if you define cloud-hosted instances as not just IaaS and a hyperscaler cloud, but also like PaaS and SaaS, and that's honestly what we are seeing, because especially the physicals shrunk 6%, and the physical includes a myriad of different technologies, not just x86 or Intel-based boxes. We are seeing that instead of trying to modernize the proprietary applications written on those machines, customers are really taking a hard look at SaaS and PaaS, and can they kind of modernize that way versus refactoring applications and then putting them onto some form of hypervisor. So that's again, it is validating what we are seeing within our customer base in terms of adoption of cloud-hosted instances. Moving to your right, yes, what is very clear here is the ground that Azure or Hyper-V has gained in the marketplace compared to VMware. VMware is still kind of leading the pack. But again, in terms of what's good is we have been talking about cloud for what? 10 plus years now, and we have been talking about cloud workload placement for that many number of years. I think this is really making people think more about that. It does. There was a time in the past where when people are thinking of virtualization or cloud adoption, cloud first, give it a name, it was everything is going to move here, right?
Yeah.
And we can see a movement away from that, right? Where if customers have Microsoft specific workloads, they're saying, hey, why not move them to an Azure centric platform? But that's not all that I have. I have other workloads, and maybe I'll keep that on vSphere and VMware and make use of it that way. So it really shows in some ways IT maturing, where it went from we're not virtualized to let's put everything in one platform, because that was kind of the way that the CIOs drove, I would say, most of the transformation. So now, no, let's be selective, right? And that's why you see that hybridness in the environment, which in a way is good. In a way, it's also increasing complexity, and I'm sure we're going to talk about that later on.
Absolutely. Yeah, it used to be, and we joked earlier about how long you and I have both been helping data centers become more resilient in one way or another. It used to be for the last several generations, there was always one gold standard for what does great IT delivery look like, right? There were mid-ranges, and then there were network servers, and then there was Windows, and then there was pizza boxes, and then there was hyper-converged. I mean, there was always this one gold standard of what great IT looked like. And then from my perspective, that then defined who the leaders in data protection and recovery would be based on who was really purpose designed for what that modern IT data center looked like. I think the problem that you're seeing on the right is there's not a new next gold standard, right? It's not that, when we left Windows, we went to VMware, and now we're going to leave VMware and go to this next thing. No. No one's shutting down the old boxes. It's becoming more hybrid than it's ever been. And to your point, that radically increases the complexity of how you're going to provide resilience for it. And frankly, it reduces the number of options that you have that can provide comprehensive protection across all the workloads that likely are going to be in the modern IT strategy. So, last piece of data on the Broadcom sentiment stuff is for those organizations that said they were going to decrease their use of vSphere as their hypervisor. The survey went on to ask about, okay, so how are you going to do that? And so the estimates that these folks had, and this was CIO Magazine, so assume they're all executive level CIO, CTO type folks, they estimated it was going to take basically an hour per workload. Figure the average enterprise at least 1,000 users or more, so several hundred workloads in that environment. An hour per workload. So if you had a couple thousand workloads, that would take you a full man year to do that. The way they expected to do that was actually for 89% or more of those organizations said they're going to have a full-time engineer. Now, Kaushik, I don't think any of them had an extra engineer sitting around in 2025 saying, you know, I've been looking for a project. Maybe I'll take care of Broadcom migrations this year, right? And if they did, so they repurposed an engineer that was hopefully going to be working on other stuff right up until they kicked this off. And then the question became, when that migration was over, because migrations are always, they have a finite date, right? But when that migration was over, where's that FTE going to go next? So there's a lot of labor questions that kind of come into this. I think this has always been one of the opportunities for where managed services really kind of comes in, where you can bring in that expertise. They do it smarter, they do it faster, and oh, by the way, you don't have an FTE when you're done. But talk about what does that engineering really look like for those that tried to move, and where were there deltas or optimizations?
Look, I mean, I think this slide represents the reason why we have seen where we have landed compared to the initial sentiments. And I would even argue that some of these numbers are understated. Yes, it might take an hour to move one VM, but migrations are never about moving just VMs. You're talking about application architecture, you're talking about networking. You know, there's a lot more that goes into it than just migrating a VM, right? You're talking about resiliency. You know, if you're shifting platforms, how are you going to protect that new platform? Probably not the same way that you did before. So there's a lot more complications that goes into any kind of migration, as we all know. And that, I like I said, I think that this is the reason why you see that people have not taken. I mean, we have seen customers who have literally in the lab, the point being in the lab, tried out a brand new platform and said, hey, it works. And some would even go to the extent of saying, if we had to pull the trigger, we can. Well, then why didn't you? Because it's one thing to test out something in the lab for a standard testing condition, if you can use that term, right, for IT. And then it's another thing to then apply that across hundreds of applications, thousands of VMs for any mid to large enterprise. Now, if you were an SMB, it might be easier for you to do that, but actually you're probably more resource constrained in that sense, right? Because you have lesser number of people. So yeah, again, this is the reason why I think we have landed up where we've landed up, even after the initial flare-ups from sentiment.
Yeah, one of the pieces of data that's actually not in the slides for today, but I encourage folks to go and take a look at the original survey work done in 24, was what were the primary things hindering you from actually moving forward with your migration, and concerns around the maturity or flexibility of the management tools, as well as skill gaps actually were a big hindrance along the way. I think from my perspective, the nugget I'll finish with on this one is, what we also saw was by time organizations started looking at the cost and complexity of running multiple hypervisors, of adding skill sets to their IT implementers, et cetera, all of a sudden, all those extra costs didn't turn out to be that much different than the cost of the delta of the licenses that Broadcom was asking for. It wasn't this boon of new budget that was going to come from migrations, and I think that affects the initial conversations we had include some discussion questions. And so what I hope folks do after this session is over, first, please have your colleagues go and watch the sessions afterwards who didn't get a chance to make it today. But we've included a couple discussion questions that you should take back to your own teams and ask yourselves, a year later, did the licensing changes actually drive effects? Did you switch or did you stay? If you switched, how did you switch? What's your plan for 2026? But hopefully this creates some conversations for your own teams along the way. Kaushik, I'm looking at the clock. And so how about we get into the next one? So we've looked at the crown jewels. We've looked at what the elephant in the room, as we say from the data center perspective. But what everyone wants to talk about on IT conversations everywhere. If it's not AI, it's ransomware. Right. So let's have a conversation about what does ransomware look like. So in this case, again, we wanted to curate a bunch of data from several different trusted sources. I have profound respect for some of the work going on over at theCUBE. If you don't watch them regularly, I hope that you'll subscribe to some of their feeds. They did a great research project last fall that I thought was really interesting as well. Let's take a look at some of their data to set up our context for this conversation. In this case, one of the questions they asked was around, has your organization experienced a cyber attack within the last 12 months? And I think it's kind of interesting that, it's almost even thirds along the way, right? So there's about a third of folks read, 29% said more than one. 37% said yes, they've had one attack in the last year. 33% are in a state of denial. I mean, they said no, that they haven't had an attack over the last year. Let's assume optimistically that all three of those numbers are valid. Actually, if you figure that out, there's almost as many that had more than one that had one. So Kaushik, if I have 3 apples in a box, and one person said, I don't need any apples, and one person said, I need an apple, and the other person said, I have 2 apples, then on average, everybody got an apple. And I think that's how you have to look at these kinds of sentiments, is that yes, if you have been hit and you didn't fix everything, you're likely to get hit again. That's where the more than once comes from. And if you haven't been hit yet, you're either in denial or you're due. Either way, this is why we're still having this conversation throughout the year. But here's the part that always gets me unsettled. And as I said, great respect for theCUBE and what they've done. I've run research projects on this particular question for several years as well. And almost always the punchline comes out the same. As much as we want to talk about encryption, as much as we want to talk about identity and all the other ways that bad actors are getting in, for many of them, if encryption or denial is part of their strategy, the very first thing they're going after is removing your ability to recover yourself so that you don't have to pay the ransom. And here's the short example of this. Laura was nice enough to open us up for today's session, and I love Laura to death. So let's use the example that Laura and I are out on a boat. We're both in Texas, so we go off in the Gulf for a little bit. We're going to do some fishing. Laura decides to push me off into the water. Now, if I can swim back to the boat, I don't have to do anything else, right? But Laura's going to charge me money in order for me to get back in that boat. So she pulls up the ladders so I can't climb up on my own. She makes sure there's nothing floating in the water. She's removing my ability to save myself so that I am more likely to pay the ransom. And Kaushik, I think this is what the data is saying there along the way. Now, I imagine you've been in a lot of really hard rooms on their worst days. Does this ring true to you as common practice?
Absolutely, absolutely. That's why you see that when any kind of cyber attack happens, not only they are trying to lock up your crown jewels in terms of the production version, the live version of the data, they're immediately trying to get to your backups because they know that's where you're going to first go. Because you'll be like, sure, I got my backups, I can restore from there, right? So, and that's what we're seeing. This actually wasn't the case early on, but as time goes by, both sides are getting wiser and smarter, both the attacker and those of us are on the receiving end. But that is absolutely what we're saying is they are locking up the live as well as the backup versions as part of the attack.
I think we ought to blame the IT administrator for this one, right? Because when they sent that when the bad actor sent the email and said, you need to owe me Bitcoin, for all those IT administrators who said, no, I'm not going to send you Bitcoin because I have a reliable backup solution. That'll teach you. And then the bad actor said, that's a good point. Let's go solve that. And I think that's where we've seen that shift over time. So probably you ought to blame, the backup vendors, whoever has a reliable backup solution for those cases. Anyway, let's talk about how bad this really gets. Other than frequency, let's talk about what the collateral damage is. Now, again, this actually comes out of theCUBE's research. I've actually run different research that had a slightly higher number for the percent of data that's affected, but a lower number for the amount of data that was recoverable along the way. And interestingly enough, when those two deltas go in different directions, you actually see the same math. But in this case, The stats show that about a fourth of the production landscape was affected. And of the affected data, about 2/3 of it was recoverable, meaning some means. Now, I'm going to pretend to be as smart as a fifth grader. So if I look at some basic algebra, what that turns out to be is, on average, organizations should expect to assume about 17% data loss. That's about a sixth of the production landscape on average was affected and then not recoverable after the fact. I've seen different numbers that show 18, 19%, others that say only 15% of your production data was irrevocably destroyed. So along the way, so let's talk about how bad this is from a data loss perspective, and then we've got a little bit of blank space down here. I want to bring up one more stat along the way.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, if I hadn't seen those stats, I would have said 20% from what we see, anecdotally speaking, and this actually goes into the whole discussion of paying the ransom, and we have seen that even if people pay the ransom, it doesn't necessarily mean that they can recover the data, because there's a lot of dynamics that goes into it. Like when a ransomware, when an attacker is deploying that payload, as they say, it depends on when you detect it. It depends on what it was doing when you stopped it. So the state of corruption of the data is actually uncontrolled. It's not like it's controlled by the attacker. It's definitely not controlled by the company who's getting attacked. So because of that uncontrolled nature of the attack, and the effect of it is encrypting your data, it's very difficult to cleanly decrypt and recover your data, even if you had the decryption key. And that's the reason why it leads to some level of irrecoverable data loss. And this is what we call compromised state of data, right? And you have to assume that even in the best case scenario, there will be some level of compromise of your data, and you got to plan ahead on how you're going to work for that. In real terms, what this means is, in case of typical business continuity disaster recovery, we all know that your data is nicely backed up and snapshotted to one single point in time, right? So all you have to do is go back to that last clean copy of data. Everything is nicely synchronized, and you bring everything up. Well, in case of cyber attack, what this basically is saying, well, you could have one type of data that is corrupted and you could recover maybe to 2 weeks ago. Another related, but a different entity or type of data is actually corrupted till about a month ago. So they are not synchronized, and that leads to an even more irrecoverable data loss, because how do you connect the dots between these two out of sync data sets? So again, like I said, I would have said 20%. We have seen this all the time, and that is why it's very important to plan ahead on how you're going to operate the business. It's not really an IT question. It is a business question in that compromised state of data.
Totally agree with that. Yeah, one of the challenges is, you and I both started off doing IT disaster recovery before cyber was really a thing. And back then, if you were worried about fire or flood or tornado, then the other copies of data that you had right before that it went crispy or drippy or blown away was good data. And so the only question you really had was, how fast can I spin up those alternative copies along the way? I think there's a mistake that a lot of folks have when it comes, if you've seen too many movies from Hollywood, that you get this decryption key from the bad actor, you type that magic key in and boom, okay, now we're back up and running. And that's not how this works. Now, from a time check perspective, let's first talk about the time that's there. On average, organizations that the Cube says that it took almost 9 days for that to recover. Now, that's arguably whatever the key workloads were that were recovered. But Kaushik, to your point, you still have to determine what is that clean point in time to recover from. And then your 9-day clock starts, right? And so it's almost as if you can have this DR-centric plan for how fast you can recover your systems. But before, somewhere around step 2, step 3, it says, go find a clean copy. And that could take you a while to go figure out that clean copy. Once you have a clean copy and a clean place to restore to, then, okay, now you're back to recovering at scale. And so there's a variance there that I think is really pretty dangerous. Let's go through a few more stats that come out of this along the way. Actually, these stats are from Rubrik's Zero Labs report, and they talk about 86% of organizations experience a successful attack. That's a little higher than the 67 that we saw in the last one. There's questions. They said 93% of victims in organizations, and again, this is not Rubrik customers, this is Rubrik's research labs, said they did pay the ransom along the way. And what I thought was really interesting on one of these stats, 74% said that, yes, they went after the backup solution, which is what we talked about already. A third said they completely removed the ability to recover themselves, right, by destroying that. So again, I love when data matches data along that way. I want to respect time, but I think there's one question that I think is worth talking about here. And again, you're going to get the discussion questions as part of the slide materials, have those conversations at home. But one of the things I thought was really interesting was, a lot of organizations will say, we stand up to terrorism, we stand up to criminals, right? And then a third of your data is shredded and your business processes are screeching to a halt and you are hemorrhaging cash and hemorrhaging bad PR. You've been in some tough rooms over the years. Talk about what's that decision tree really look like when it comes to, do we pay to get back up and running? What is the lesser evil?
Yeah, so before I get into that, the first point is, even if you decide to pay, it doesn't mean that you'll be able to recover. So that's definitely there. Payment is not equal to recovery. But what the decision tree looks like, the first and foremost question, after the sentiments and feelings stuff goes away, is, can we restore without paying, right? And if it is within an acceptable period of time, like you said, once you figure out from which point in time to do the restoration, for average is 9 days. Honestly, I've seen much longer than that. I've seen weeks, right? So if we can restore without paying and we have that confidence, then is that going to be within an acceptable period of time, right?
Sure.
Like, for example, if it is like, we can restore, it's gonna take us 3 weeks. Well, what does that equate in terms of damage to the business, right? And that's another thing that I really harp on with people is, you need to quantify what is your cyber risk, and if you can't do that, and it's not the same as, hey, what's an hour of downtime going to cost for me? Because typically in a normal DR situation, you're talking about a matter of hours that you're going to be down, right? Your RTO is in a couple of hours for top tier applications to maybe 24 hours for the lower tier application. You're not talking about that. Like you said, your average is 9 days. So it's not just the downtime, so it's not just the downtime of per hour cost, but what is the exponential cost to the business as days are going by? So I highly encourage people to do a cyber risk quantification, which is very important. But so you need to understand, if we pay, is it going to be within the acceptable time? And cyber risk quantification can help you with that. And if not, okay, then let's talk about, was my data exfiltrated, right? If my data was not exfiltrated, then okay, the bias towards not paying kind of is high because you feel like there was no leakage of data, right? If there was exfiltrated, then do we see some credible proof of that? Samples, your data floating in the cloud, in the dark web somewhere, right? Then the next thing is, like I said, operational outage cost per day. What is this life impacting? Like, for example, if you are in an industry which is life impacting and it is safety related, then that risk or tolerance goes down. Healthcare,
absolutely,
right?
Military.
Yep, exactly, right? What is it going to do, even if you have like a week of downtime, to your customers' market confidence? Like, say, if your ATMs are down for a week, or even like 5 days, is that something that you'll be able to handle or deal with if you're a bank, right? So all of these things, and then of course there is legal and regulatory pressures as well that goes in. Regulatory pressures are kind of funny because on one side, nobody wants you to pay the ransom, because it might be state-sponsored terrorism or whatever it is. On the other side, regulators are saying you can't be down because it's causing damage to your constituents, right? So it's kind of a dual-edged sword. So all these factors goes in, and this is how we see this kind of play out in the war room for, I would say, first 72 hours. And usually they make the decision within that time frame as they're figuring out with their incident response team and their red teams coming in, they make the decision whether they want to pay or not.
I will say this for the folks at home. One of the things that we always encourage is you need to have most of those conversations and have something on paper before the attack happens, because level heads don't happen in war rooms, right? The war room may decide to override the plan, and some extenuating circumstance may pivot the plan. But this is a conversation that you need to have a bunch of pessimists in the room saying, well, what if this happens, and how bad could this be, and what could go wrong here, and have a documented flow to say, okay, this is the plan unless something changes. You do not want to be drafting this from scratch beforehand. All right, so we've got a third posture. Sorry, go ahead.
Now, I think this is even more important, I would say, for cyber than it ever was for disaster recovery, in my opinion.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, because some of the outside ramifications, your time is variable. Right before, you could make all those questions just based on cost of solution investment versus cost of business impact and problem. Right. Much shorter math, right? Exactly. This is much more protracted. All right, we've got a couple other areas, and again, this is also going to lean into the organizational side of all those people that are going to be in that war room along the way. This particular research doesn't come from one of the other analyst firms and or sources we provided, but actually from Data Protection Matters. So let's kind of talk about, we did a research project, last summer into the fall, 502 business continuity and disaster recovery leaders. And Kaushik, one of the things that you and I kind of leaned in on when we unpacked this data earlier was typically these kinds of survey instruments go after the CIO, CTO, and the IT chain of command, or they go to the CISO and the information security cyber chain of command. This was actually to business continuity and disaster recovery experts, including some folks who do crisis management, some folks in InfoSec. So these are the folks that live and breathe resilience 10 hours a day, every day, 48 hours on weekends. So one of my favorite questions that came out of the survey, in fact, it was actually the topic of a recent Forbes article, was around asking those folks, what percentage of key processes are actually resilient in your environment? And the punchline number was 59%. Now, this is a good mix of mid-market, enterprise, large enterprise customers, and yet, let's round that up to 60. If 3 out of 5 of your key business processes are resilient, Kaushik, simple math here, that means 2 out of 5 of whatever your business is relying on will not bounce back as expected. 1, this should scare everybody. And 2, does it surprise you?
No, and I think the operative word here, I'm not saying that 59% of all their business processes are actually resilient. No. They're saying 59% of their key business processes are actually resilient. So I wanted to harp on that, right? And no, I mean, it is scary, is what I can say. We do have customers, as you can imagine, across the spectrum. We have those who are very serious about business continuity and disaster recovery. And I can tell you, it's not about the industry. If people think that, if they're regulated industries, they're more serious about it. No, it's all about, in my opinion, leadership, right? And whether the leadership is serious about resiliency of their business, right? And that doesn't mean that you need to bring everything back up within an hour. No, right? No. But it means having an understanding of what's critical, what needs to come up within what period of time so that the business can continue. So it is scary, it is unfortunate, but I would have to agree that, it's probably in line with what we see. We still see a lot of people who basically sign a technology contract for disaster recovery, but they never test it.
Right.
You know,
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah.
and that leads to this,
Sure.
right?
Yeah, that
So
breaks my heart. And for the record, if in case you are multitasking at home and you just got this going and running on the background, please pause for a second and write this down. If you are not testing, you don't have a plan, you have a hope. All right, just write that on a Post-it note and then replay this section later along the way. Yeah, you're right. So I mean, certainly there's going to have a large spectrum here. It is not industry specific. It is not size specific. It is not locality or region specific. And yeah, you can see in the green, there's a good section of folks that are better than that average. But the average is 2 out of 5 of whatever you actually rely on the most will not come back. All right, a couple other stats that come out of this along the way. So the same survey, we asked, what were all the kinds of disruptions that you have? Now, unlike a normal IT-centric survey, we also wanted to look at some of the business level things that can also be equally disruptive to your organization along the way. So yes, you're going to see IT failures. Yes, you're going to see natural disasters. Of course, you're going to see cyber. I thought it was interesting that the #1 most frequent experience of what caused an outage was when a downstream third-party supplier, so the folks that print your checks for you, the folks that ship your boxes for you, the folks that handle your call centers for first level tech support, all of those downstream third-party providers, 51% of organizations said they'd had an outage caused by a third party. And Kaushik, let's run the math for this for a second. So you decided to optimize your business. You've identified some third-party suppliers that can offload some of those things, and I'm not paying for the HR anymore and all the things that go along with that. Now they're running their own IT systems. Well, 10 years ago, those would have been your people and your IT systems, and you would have been responsible for ensuring the resilience of those teams and functions. Now you've outsourced that, and they have an outage. Your business process stops, even though it's no longer in your umbrella of control. And for that happened in 51% of the environment surveyed here. And oh, by the way, for 1 out of 6, for 16%, it was the cause of the most impactful disruption they experienced over that 2-year time period. That also should wake some people up. Amen?
absolutely. And this is something that this is where I think it comes full circle to our initial part of our discussion, where we were talking about 41% of the workloads are now in some form of cloud-hosted environments, right? This is where it comes full circle, right? Where we are seeing more and more adoption for right reasons. From a business standpoint, it makes sense. Like if you can leverage a third-party provider to take care of your point-of-sale systems with edge caching, why wouldn't you? Why would you try to keep it in-house? So it makes complete sense to do this, but you have to recognize that as you do this, you are increasing the complexity of your IT environment. I'm not going to give any details to specify where this happened, but this was a couple of years back. It was a global outage of sorts, multi-day, with a particular company, very large company, and we were engaged with them at that point of time. And the CIO at that time came and said, we have at least 300 external endpoints that we're dependent on, right, in running. Now, that's a very large enterprise globally operating. So I'm not saying everybody has that, but that's the level of complexity that has come into this. As people talking about serverless, as people talking about cloud adoption, that stuff is running somewhere. And not only that, you might be giving it to a third party, and then they might be giving to some of their portions to another third party, right? So there's constant layering. Remember the mortgage crisis? It's kind of like that, right? Very soon you have no idea where
that's a great point. Yeah.
Right? So this is something that is part of our discussions with our customers when it comes to business continuity, right? That you have to bring the SaaS in there. Some industries are more reliant on SaaS than others. Like if you think about the federal credit unions, they use a lot of SaaS. And this number for them is probably closer to 70% than 50%. Yeah. So first, be aware of it. Second, ask the right kind of questions. to your third-party providers, know what to ask, map out your risks so that you can manage it. It's not, this picture doesn't mean reverse everything and bring everything in-house. No. It's just pointing you where you need to focus on as things have evolved.
That's right. Yeah, I think the takeaway for me on this one is, I mean, if you're using third-party suppliers and providers, you're doing it for the right business reasons, right? But kind of like, let's use SaaS as the example, right? So if the data was in your data center, you'd back it up because your business was relying on it. If your data is in a cloud, you still got to back it up, right? And you can't be selective on that. And so the same thing, if you have business processes that you've outsourced, you still have to know they have a resilience posture. I had a client I was meeting with last week, a large healthcare organization. And we talked about one of the biggest challenges they have is they've outsourced massive functions. And it comes back to, if you're relying on that data, it's your data. You have to back that up. And also the other part of that is, if whatever resilience plans that you have, are you part of their resilience testing? And oh, by the way, when you're doing your tabletops, are they part of your resilience testing? So that's a two-way street. So let's talk about this for a second, because we kind of beat on third parties as a potential area of risk when it comes to resilience. I'm also going to offer that it is a source of solution in resilience as well. So in this case, one of the other questions in the same survey was around what type of third-party service providers are currently being used or on retainer. And I know this is going to feel self-serving, but the data is what the data is. And the number one most common type of service that was actually part of a resilience strategy was a backup as a service to a cloud provider along the way. Now, coming in those top three, I color-coded the data because I do think there's some macro trends that you see. Backup as a service, so get my data out of the building and to somebody who knows how to smartly run backups. Security as a service, so they're adding detection and monitoring capabilities. And then threat intelligence. And so all three of these seem like I'm going to use smarter humans that are purpose-built and complement my existing overall IT strategy with skills and technologies that I don't want to have to maintain and run in-house. So I like that for the top three along the way. The next two are in red because that's what you need when bad things happen. So that's instant response for cyber attacks, external legal for cyber and ransomware. So these are the types of skills that you will need on your worst day. Those are in red. Next couple down. So this is where we actually do something more than just the tactical. This is where we actually think about how do we actually elevate our capability. And that's where you get disaster recovery as a service, failing over to cloud hosted infrastructure. That's where you get critical event management. You get notification to your teams, right? So this is where we're actually elevating capabilities with superior offerings. And then lastly, wish they were higher, but expertise for its own sake. So BCDR planning, BCDR auditing, legal counsel, et cetera. But I love the fact that these come back as we want to supplement with better tech and better and more skilled humans. We know we're going to need extra hands on deck on our worst day, and we're going to elevate our capabilities through superior offerings that we can't actually stand up on our own. Frankly, Kaushik, I think they got this right as far as how that mix goes. And I know it's because you're hitting the top of the list, but how are you feeling on this?
No, I mean, I love the way that you summarize this, and that's exactly what it is technology, people and expertise, and then obviously one thing that I wanted to highlight there that I don't see here, especially when you're talking about ransomware and cyber attack, is it's great that you have data backups. I mean, not all backups are created equal, so you got to be careful. Just because you have a backup of data doesn't necessarily mean that's going to protect you from a cyber attack, or rather allow you to recover from a cyber attack. So, you know, the typical cybersecurity zip code, as they call it, 22110, you know, so all of that stuff needs to be there. But people oftentimes forget that you also need to have a target clean room to recover onto. Right? I've had so many conversations where people are like, well, if entirety of my production infrastructure is locked up, I have a bigger problem. Well, you do, right? You don't want to assume that only a small portion of your infrastructure is going to be locked up, and therefore you can use the remainder as a clean room. And what's going to happen to what's happening there? Are you going to stop doing that? So having, and the only reason I bring that up is the cloud infrastructure is way at the bottom. And people don't think about that they think, I got the data, I got my security, I have my red team and all that, and type of crisis, but where are you going to recover to? And you got to, again, plan that out, because I've heard some people say, well, I'll just spin up instances in AWS. Okay, how are you going to get the data from where it is into AWS? How much time is that going to take? So I think overall they've got this right, but just wanted to highlight some of those finer points.
No, absolutely. Great ads. All right, again, you're going to have some homework questions that kind of comes out of this. If you go to the Data Protection Matters site, we've got a couple other add-ons for this, really looking specifically at what is those organizational dynamics between those folks that do business continuity, those folks that do crisis management, those that do IT disaster recovery, and those that do information sec. Hopefully some of these questions also stimulate some fun topics for you at home. You're going to get all of these as part of the takeaways. That's kind of it for the three sections, Kaushik, I really wanted to deliver with you. I think we can give the rest of the time back to Laura. Laura, I think you've got a few last things you want to talk about. And then if we've got any questions and there's time left over, maybe we can pile on or take them after. But Laura, back to you.
Thank you, Jason. Yes, we did have a couple of questions. I'm going to quickly go through some slides here and hopefully get to one or two of these questions. If we don't get to your question, don't worry, we'll follow up with you after this to make sure we get your question responded to. Just wanted to quickly highlight that another part of this whole resilience picture is operational resilience. And in the last decade, the industry has really seen a fair amount of regulation in just requiring organizations to not only have operational resilience, but prove that they have it. And here are some of the guidelines that are really a big part of the global picture. Just keep in mind, if you're operating in any of these regions, you need to be following these regulations. And if you don't know if you can follow them, this is where you can turn to us for help. I really don't push people out of boats, even though I get used in analogies a lot like that. I promise I won't push you out of a boat, and neither will anyone at 1111. We're going to be your life preserver here. We have a lot of experience in this. Kaushik's team does a great job helping our customers make sure they get all that they need to get, and we provide the help and fill in any gaps that you may have. One thing I really want to highlight here is our migration. We really have great onboarding and cloud migration. So this is one area of expertise that we can really help you with if you're looking at your cloud transition right now. We always say, don't take our word for it. The industry has given us some awards to recognize in the many ways that we are helping people. And finally here, I want to highlight, we have this global cyber trend survey that we released the results of it last October during Cybersecurity Awareness Month. This is going to be the first of its kind, so we hope to release another one this year. This is good information to get a baseline of where your colleagues are in this type of area. So definitely follow the QR code there and download this. We do have some questions that came in. Let me look at a couple of these. Well, and I'll go back to the QR code for those of you that are asking for it. Well, we've heard a lot about clouds today. Is 2026 the year that tape dies? This is a great question.
Oh, can I go first? Can I go first on this one, please?
Yes, please.
So, there's still some folks out there that still say that tape is a 4-letter word. And just unpack that joke for a second. God bless tape, right? I mean, we're having pressure around how do I make sure that my data can remain unscathed. It is harder to have a better air gap than to take a tape out of a drive, put it on a shelf. That is a physical air gap on your data. We're seeing pressure around, especially when we look at large data sets, so big data, LLMs, et cetera. It's hard to think about how would I store volumes of data at scale for a long period of time. Think bio, think healthcare, et cetera. Tape has the lowest cost of ownership of anything you're going to put, as far as I'm going to put that tape out there for a while. Would I want to use it as a rapid resilience mechanism? That wouldn't be my first choice. I would rather use on-prem disk. I would rather use cloud that has a fantastic infrastructure, especially if I'm Why BAS when you can DRAS and spin that stuff up in some cloud someplace? There's all kinds of things I would rather do than bring it back from tape. But no, 2026 is not the year that tape dies. And by the way, neither is 27 and neither should 28.
Couldn't agree more with you.
And Kaushik, I heard you mention earlier that we are still seeing a lot of good resilient stories around tape, correct?
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Just like Jason said, it's a great strategy from an air gapping standpoint. Doesn't give you the fastest recovery. We do have customers who actually do recovery from tapes for a variety of reasons that they have. But again, tape is not going away. Just like mainframes, right? We keep hearing mainframe is dead. And here we are, it's still alive, still kicking, and still going. So I think it has a place and time in the overall strategy, overall resilience strategy, to take care of that. But that shouldn't be the strategy to recover from if you want speed.
Sounds like we shouldn't put all of our eggs in one basket. So
that's right.
True.
We are running short on time, but with the few seconds that we have left, first I want to say, if we didn't get to your question, we will follow up with you after this presentation. But I would love to let our guests, Kaushik and Jason, take 30 seconds here with one more thing that you want to leave our audience with before we close out today.
Kaushik, you want to go first?
Sure. So I know we've covered a wide range of topics, everything from Broadcom to ransomware and resilience. I think we have talked a lot about Broadcom, but on resilience, the main thing I want to focus on is, especially with cyber, it's a matter of when, not a matter of if. Cyber knows it doesn't discriminate in terms of industry, in terms of size. I have seen a 4-person company go out of business because of cyber. And then we all know the well-advertised larger organizations that are attacked by cyber. So my main, request to everybody is don't wait for it. Plan ahead. Planning is very important. Like I talked about, quantifying your risk. That's very important because if you don't know what that is, you can't get the funds that you need to in investing in the right places. There's a lot of places to invest in. You need to know where exactly you need to invest in. Second thing is plan ahead in terms of how you're going to operate, if you have a compromised state of data, right? The age-old tabletops, that we all know, those who've been in resilience, is actually even more relevant for a cyber use case, right? I would rather have all of us cry in a simulation than cry when it actually happens, right? So it's very important to have that orchestration done in a simulation mode so we know how we can tackle about it. So if planned right, just like we are seeing, cyber attackers getting better, we're actually also seeing companies getting really mature and bouncing back in less than that 9 days that Jason talked about, right? If you can detect it before, and if quickly you have all your data right, you have the clean room, there is no reason why you got to be down for days together. It can be done. Amen. As long as it's planned right.
Love that. I'm gonna pile on to one of the things that you talked about around understanding the business requirements along the way, and I'm just going to leave folks with this: resilience starts in the boardroom, not the data center. Right? I think often what happens is that when we focus too much on cyber, we forget about all the other bad things that can happen, right? Just because you're worried about ransomware doesn't mean that fire and flood and tornado doesn't still happen. Doesn't mean that third parties might have an outage. Doesn't mean that your favorite web service may go offline, not because of the web or because of you, but because of some intermediary layer. There's all kinds of other things that happen. And so when your resilience posture is overly ransomware centric, I think we lose sight of all the other things. That said, to Kaushik's point, when you don't have a whole comprehensive view of what matters to the business, of which there are just simply IT as dependencies, we also run short of the level of prioritization, and that equates testing, that equates budget, et cetera. So resilience starts in the boardrooms, not the data center.
Those are great words to end on. Thank you so much, Jason Buffington, Kaushik Ray, and on behalf of everyone here at 1111 Systems, thank you for joining us for today's presentation. Have a great
Laura.
day.
Thank you.
Thanks.